Hi everyone, welcome to the Blue Tit tutorial. This is the reference photo that I used. I downloaded it from Pixabay. It was taken by Wendy Corner-Kay. If you'd like to download it yourself, I've included a link on the supplies list. This is a piece of Arches cold-pressed watercolour paper. It's A3 size. I've stretched it and attached it to my gator board. I've got it in portrait orientation. I'll put some washi tape around the inside edge of the gummed tape, and that will give me a white border around the outside edge of the painting when I take it off the board. This is my Casaneo oval pointed wash brush. I'm going to use this to paint some water onto the body of the bird and onto the background as well. Make sure your pencil lines aren't too dark before you start doing this. There's 4 places on my line drawing where I've left the line off the edge. Just here, up here on the head, at the back of the head, and on the back of the wing. I left those blank to remind myself that that's where I want to create a lost edge, where I don't put any paint. I'm painting water all over the body of the bird where the yellow is, and I'll take this water off onto the background as well. The only thing I'm avoiding is that strip of dark feathers down the front tummy. Now I'm taking it onto the background. So on the yellow feathers on the bird, and then onto the background as well. If you don't want to paint the background, keep the water within the edges of the bird. I'll use my Da Vinci Maestro number 8 brush to put the paint on. I'll get some Windsor lemon, just mix it with a bit of water. And I'll paint that onto the bird, onto the wet paper. Taking it off into the background. It's fairly bright, my paint colour. I haven't watered it down too much. I've wet those white feathers beside that blue strip that runs down his tummy. So the paint is going to drift onto there a little bit. So I'll take a tissue to get it off. I'm trying to avoid a hard paint line that runs down there. There's also a white patch of feathers over here where I haven't put any paint. Now I'm going to tilt the board and get the paint to run up into the top corner. Just want it to drift off there. I keep putting a bit more paint to make it run. I'll drop a bit more on there. I don't want it to be too pale. I'll use my brush to take off that excess paint. And I'll also use it to take this edge in a bit so that it's not so straight looking. So I'm just using my brush like a sponge. It takes a bit of paint off. That has dried now, so I want to paint in these little blue feathers at the top. So again, I wet the blue feathers, but I also take it off into the background. I want the paint to drift off the bird there as well. If you don't want that to happen on yours, you need to keep the water within the edges of the bird. I've also taken water across the front where the white feathers are so that I don't get a hard edge there. I'm going to use some French ultramarine to paint these on. I paint that straight onto the wet paper. Now, as I said, I've wet along the front of the head, so I won't get a hard edge along here. Now I'll tilt the board with a bit more paint on my brush, and I'll get that paint to bleed off into the background there. Just lifting it off the table. And I'll make sure there's no water lines forming anywhere else. So there it is, dry now. I took a photo of my painting at this stage and I've included it for you to download. This is Progress Photo 1. I'm going to mix some grey from French Ultramarine and Burnt Sienna. I mix the two colours together. I tend to favour the blue when I do this. Put a touch of Burnt Sienna in it. There will be some paint separation on my paper after I've done this, and that's part of the beauty of watercolour, so don't be concerned if the grey paint that you mix separates on your paper. This is the reason why I mix my grey, because I like the way that it does that. My grey is ready to go, so I can wet the area where I'm going to put this grey paint now. If you have a look at the reference photo, there's a sort of a grey colour all over most of the yellow. I think that's probably because the bird looks like it's lit from behind. So I'm wetting all of the yellow feathers and I'll paint the grey paint where I see it on the reference photo. Even those white feathers on the front look grey to me. Okay, so all of those yellow feathers are wet now. I'll pick up some grey paint that I mixed and I'll paint that onto the wet paper. The area here in the middle, I'm not going to put any paint. I want a lost edge there, so I want it to blend off into the background so you can't see where the bird finishes there. I take this grey paint onto those white feathers that are on the tummy because they look grey to me. I haven't completely covered the white paper there, I've left a bit of white paper showing. And then I keep taking it out onto the yellow feathers. It's a bit darker down the bottom there where it touches the branch. I'm flicking my brush and the water on the paper gives me all those soft edges. Okay, now I want to darken the blue feathers on top of the head, so I need to wet the paper again. I wet the paper out past the back of the head, which will give me soft edges on my strokes there. I think I'll switch to my number 5 Maestro brush to paint these feathers. I'll use some French Ultramarine. And I'll start to deepen the colour. I might put a bit more pigment into it to make it darker. So this group of feathers is darker at the back and around the left-hand side. So where my brush is now, there I'm pulling that paint on the dry paper. waited a few minutes until the paper wasn't quite as wet as it was, and I'm dropping in a bit more pigment there now. And because it's not as wet as it was, I'll see if I can get some little flicks showing on the back of the head here. So the paper's still wet, it's just not as wet as it was. So the paper is damp now, it's not sopping wet. And that allows me to paint those little flicks without them spreading too far. I'll paint a bit of water down here on these white feathers, and I'll use some of the grey that I mixed from French ultramarine and burnt sienna. Even though these cheek feathers over here are white on the reference photo, I'm going to put a little bit of grey paint on them to break it up a bit. So I'll wet it with water, and now I've got the grey paint again. So French ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. Now I want to mix a green for the green feathers on the back. So instead of getting a green out, I'll use the colours that I've got here. This is French ultramarine and Windsor lemon. I'll mix them together to make a green. I wash my brush out in between picking up the colours so I don't dirty them. I'll wet the paper first. So this little patch on the back, on the wing, I think is sort of a green colour. So I'll wet them first and then I'll put that green paint on here. Not going to do anything really fancy with it. I'll pick up the green paint. And I'll paint that on there while it's wet. Here's where I've left the little gap in my pencil line to try and remind myself to keep the paint off there, which will give me a lost edge. The lost and soft edges help to make the bird look less flat. If you have a hard line running all the way around the edge of things, it tends to make them look more flat. So here I've got nothing on my brush. I'm smoothing that paint out. I'm going to pick up a little bit of indigo on there. If you don't have indigo, you could use some Prussian blue here, or maybe even some Payne's grey. I'll drop that on there while it's wet to darken up that front section. And then I pull a few little flicks into the yellow to create some jagged edges on the yellow feathers. Moving on up here to the white feathers on the top of the head, I'm wetting that area with water. I want to put a bit of grey paint there as well. This is the grey mixed from French ultramarine and burnt sienna. That brings in the side of the head there. And then I'll put a bit of colour over the top of the front of the head and also over the eye, I think. I won't put any at the back there, and that will give me a lost edge at the back below the blue feathers. Okay, I think that's good. I'm going to take a photo of my painting again. And here it is here. I've included this photo for you to download. This is Progress Photo 2. Now I want to paint the dark ring of feathers that run around the neckline. So I'll wet the paper again with water, but I extend the water past the edges of that ring so that the paint will bleed for me and not give me hard edges. So when you put the water on, make it extend past the area where you'll be painting. I'll use indigo, I think, first. And I paint that onto the wet paper. This will be covered with a darker colour over the top, and I'll leave some of this showing through in places. If you don't have indigo, use something like Prussian blue here. You can see it bleeding a little bit along those edges. I keep going all the way around the back. I think I might have mixed a bit more pigment into my mixture to make it a bit darker. My paper is still wet, but it's not sopping wet. It's giving me those little soft edges along the edge where it touches the other colours. But I think it's getting a bit dry now, and I may have to dry it off and then re-wet it to paint this section. We'll see what it's like. It feels a bit dry, but I'll put the paint on and see how I go. It's too dry at the front now, I feel, so I'm going to put a bit of water back there. And then I continue on with the paint. Sometimes it's a bit too wet and the paint spreads too far, so just be careful that it's not too wet. I've only got a tiny amount of paint on my brush. Now I want to make a darker colour that I can paint over the top of that area. So I thought I'd mix some French ultramarine with some Payne's grey. I feel that the Payne's grey would be too grey, so I thought if I mix the two together, that should give me something close to what I want. I'm wetting the paper again. This time I'm going to keep the water contained within the blue area. I won't wet it past there onto the other feathers. I'll use some of that colour I just mixed. That's French ultramarine and Payne's grey mixed together. I'll paint that onto that wet area. What I want to do is leave a little bit of this lighter colour that I just painted on showing in places. So I won't completely cover it with this colour. I think I need to wet my paper. I think it's drying and I need to wet this area as well. And then I keep dotting that colour onto the wet paper. Okay, you can still see that other colour showing through in a few places. Now I need to take it across the middle of the head where the eye is. Before I do that though, I'll put a bit more of this paint down here along the edge. Now I'll wet this section behind the eye. That's water. And now I've got the paint again. This is French ultramarine mixed with Payne's grey. I'll take this colour underneath the eye and also over the top of it, I think. I've decided to work on dry paper for the front section of that stripe. I'll try and paint it as I see it on the reference photo. The blue feathers here tend to have a diagonal, triangular look to them. I'm coming back over the top of it now with some Payne's Grey on its own. I might put a bit of that back here too. Paper's dry back here now. I'll take the paint out of my brush and I'll use my damp brush to see if I can tease a little bit of that paint out so that it's not such a hard edge there. I run it along. Yeah, there we go. The paint bleeds with the water that I put there. It softens the edge a bit. Now I want to turn my attention to this strip of blue feathers down the front. So I've wet that with water, but I've wet all the way around the outside edge of it, not just the strip itself. I'll use French Ultramarine mixed with Payne's Grey here, and then I'll use Payne's Grey over the top. So some of this colour will show through. And as I said, I've wet all the way around the outside edge of this strip of feathers so that I get soft edges all the way around. I thought it would look a bit harsh if I had hard edges around the outside of it. Now I've got Payne's Grey on its own with nothing mixed into it. The paper's still wet from when I did the first layer. Now I'm painting this second darker layer over the top, and you can see I'm leaving a bit of that other colour showing. I don't want to completely cover it. I'll leave that for a second. I'm moving up here to this little eye on the right hand side. I've just wet it with water. And now I've got the grey mixture, French Ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. And that creates a little bit of fluff beside the eye that I'll paint in later. Coming back down to this little strip of feathers, it's still damp, but only slightly. Got a tiny bit of water on my brush. I thought I'd drop the water on there to create some watercolour blooms, and that will break that section up and create a bit of texture. Now I've got some of the grey mixture and I'm painting over the top of the eye. This is on dry paper. This is French Ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. I've left the little white highlight showing. I'll also use this colour to paint in the beak. This is on dry paper as well. So that's French Ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. This is my Faber-Castell waterproof black ink pen. I'm going to use this to draw in the pupil. The paint is dry, of course. I think this is easier than trying to use the brush. I've got to leave a little grey edge around the outside edge of it. That forms the rim around the eye. This pen is both waterproof and archival. So if you're going to use a pen, make sure it's waterproof and archival. Archival meaning that it's going to last a long time, like your watercolour paint. Now I've got a little bit of lamp black paint and I'm painting that in front of the eye and behind it. I'll put a little bit of it at the top around the rim to darken that. The beak is dry. I'm going to put some more colour on the bottom beak, so I've just wet it with water. And I've got some Payne's Grey now. The bottom beak is darker, so I need to put this darker colour over the top. I thought I'd leave a little bit of the lighter colour showing. I've got a bit of a waterline showing here. The paint has drifted to the edge of the water, so I'll use my little eradicator brush to get rid of that. And now I've got my black pen again, and I'm filling in the other eye. You can just see the tip of it, or the edge of it. I've got my mechanical pencil now. I'm straightening the top of the beak. I think I'll run some Payne's grey along there as well. I'll wet it with water first. The bottom beak is dry, and this is a bit of Payne's grey. I've just wet the bottom beak again, and I've put a bit more Payne's grey along that bottom edge. Just felt it wasn't dark enough in comparison to the top beak. I'm happier with that now. I'm thinking I need a bit more grey on the cheek patch, so I'm wetting it with water. And I've got my grey paint again, French ultramarine and burnt sienna mixed together. I feel I need to put that on to break up the white expanse of paper that I've got there. I've just wet above here on the white paper as well, and I'm putting a bit more grey up here too. So that's on wet paper as well. Onto the flight feathers now. This is French ultramarine on its own. There's nothing mixed with it other than a little bit of water. I'm painting on dry paper here. There's a little strip of white feathers there that I had to remember to leave just below the green feathers. There's also some little blue feathers here. This is French ultramarine still, and my paper is dry here as well. I'll soften that edge there. Now for the tail feather. This is also on dry paper and French ultramarine here as well. Along the front here near the branch, the feathers are a bit darker, so I thought I'd paint a bit of a darker colour there. So I've just wet it with water, and I'm thinking some Payne's grey along here will work okay. So I painted along the edge where the feathers touch the branch, and then hopefully it will bleed with the water. Okay, I think I've got enough paint there. I'll take the paint out of my brush, and I'll use my clean brush to push the paint up a bit more. I want to darken the front edge of this little feather here, so I've just wet it with water, and now I have some Payne's grey on my brush. I run that along the front edge and it bleeds back over the feather. And I pull that colour a little way into the yellow feathers to create those little separations there. Down here on the underside of the flight feathers, I've got some Payne's grey. I think my paper is damp here, but you could paint this on dry paper as well. Again, I flick it up into the white feathers, and that creates a few little separations there. This one here, I'm painting Payne's Grey as well. That's the underside of the tail. I'm painting that on dry paper. It's not too dark. I do want to go darker, so I'm making sure that it's not really super dark at this stage. I'll feather it off at the bottom there. That creates those little feathers. I'll wet this one with water, and I'm going to put some Payne's Grey along the front of it as well, same way I did the one above. The lighter blue will show at the back of the feather. While I wait for those feathers to dry completely, I thought I'd put a bit more Windsor lemon onto the yellow parts. I've wet this area with water and I'm dropping the paint on now. That brightens up that left-hand side that's in the light. Back over to these flight feathers, I'm wetting the outside of it with some water. Now I have some Payne's Grey on my brush, and I want to separate these into individual feathers. I don't want to create perfect straight lines like I see on the reference photo. I'd rather them be a bit looser. So that's why I've put the water on there. I have found that if you make your lines too straight and uniform, it tends to look stiff. So this looks a bit more natural when you break it up a bit. So I'm doing my own thing here. I'm not really following the reference photo. So rather than obviously stating that there's more than one feather there, I've just suggested that there's a group of feathers there. This is a little bit of Payne's Grey that I'm painting above those white feathers. I'm on dry paper there. Now I'm wetting the underside of the tail feathers. At the moment it looks like I've got one tail feather there, but if you look at the reference photo, there's several feathers. So I'm darkening the left-hand side as I see it on the reference photo. This is Payne's Grey that I'm using. I thought I'd run it up this left side and then it would bleed back over the feathers and make it look like there's more than one there. I'll push that up a bit further. Everything's dry now. If you look at this tail feather, there's a darker section underneath the flight feathers. I'll paint that on with some more French ultramarine on the wet paper. While that's wet, I'll drop a bit of Payne's Grey on there to deepen the shadow further. I've just wet underneath the flight feathers with some water, and this is Payne's Grey that I've got. And this is darkening that section. I felt it wasn't dark enough. I'll pull a bit of that colour back onto the white feathers there too to create a few little separations. Now that it's dry, I'm using a bit more Payne's Grey. This is on the dry paper. I'm darkening it and making it look like there's more than one feather there as well. Left a little strip of lighter colour to indicate that there's a little feather going up there. And then I take the paint out of my brush and use my damp brush to soften my paint edge now so that it's darker at the top and it gradually gets lighter as it works its way down to the bottom of the feathers. I need some more grey paint mixed, so I'll do this again. This is French ultramarine, and I'll mix it with burnt sienna. This is for the branch. If you put more burnt sienna than French ultramarine, your grey will be warmer, whereas if you put more of the blue in, it's going to be a cooler grey. Please yourself about that. I want to work on wet paper again. I'll start with the bottom section of the branch. So I'm wetting it with water up to that bottom foot, where the bottom foot touches the branch. I've got it a bit out of the camera frame there, I'm sorry. I'll take it all the way down to the bottom of the paper. So that's all nice and wet now. I haven't extended the water past the edges of my pencil lines. I've got the grey that I mixed. I'm sorry, I'm out of the camera frame there. Right up next to the foot I am. So I've got the paint on there. What I'm going to do is lift my board to make it flow down the branch if I can. A little bit. I'll put a bit more paint on, let it drift down there. What I want to do is keep most of the colour near the bird, and then the outer sections of the branch I'll just suggest that they're there. Grey that I mix generally separates when I put it on the paper, particularly if there's water on the paper. Don't be concerned about that. I think I mentioned that at the start of the video. That's part of the beauty of it. That's why I mix my grey, because I get that paint separation. I get some beautiful blues and browns showing in the grey, and that makes it much more interesting to look at than just having a flat grey. So here I'm painting down the branch, but you can see I've got most of the colour near the bird. Here I've got much more white paper showing down lower. Now I'm painting over the top of my pencil lines. I thought all I'd do here is paint over my pencil lines, and I'm not going to fuss with it any more than that. So that's suggesting the bottom of the branch. It's telling the eye that this is a branch, but what you need to look at is the bird. Have a little look down here, but I want you to look up at the bird where all that beautiful colour is. I also like to repeat the colours that I've used on the bird in my branches. So I've got some Windsor lemon here that I'm dropping on. I tend not to look at the reference photo when I paint the branch. I don't want to get bogged down in the detail that I see on the reference photo. So I've put it aside and I'm painting without it. What I'm doing at the moment is using my number 5 brush to tidy up the edges to make sure I've got them as I want them. I've got a bit of Payne's Grey paint now. I'm starting to darken the bottom edge of the branch, and again I'm putting the paint near the bird. That's where I want the darkest paint. As I work my way down, it becomes lighter. Now I can paint the area in between the 2 feet, so I wet that with water. Then I use my grey paint again. It's fairly dark. Again, this is where I want most of the colour. I flick it up into the feathers a bit. Take it over to that other foot. Now I'll wet the other side. I won't take the water all the way to the edge here. I'll stop it short of that. And I'll keep the water within the branch like I did down lower. Then I use the grey again. of the colour is near the bird, as I move my way out, I'll use less paint. More white paper will be showing. I'm at the edge of my water now, so here I'll be painting on dry paper just to indicate the edge of the branch. Just here the paper's dry. The section in the middle between the 2 feet is still wet, so I'll drop a bit of Payne's grey in there to darken that bottom edge up. And then I'll take it over here as well. I'm only running it along the bottom edge because it's darker along the bottom. And I'll drop some Windsor Lemon over here as well. I might see if I can drop a few water droplets into this area. It's nearly dry, not quite, and that will create some watercolour blooms. It disturbs the pigment, it'll create a bit more texture. So there it is, dry now. And I'm thinking I need to darken this little group of feathers up here a little bit more. I've just wet that area with water and I've got some more Payne's grey now. I felt that they needed to be a touch darker. The claws I'm going to keep super simple and just paint them in with some of my grey mixture, French ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna, and that's on dry paper. Up here on the top of the head, I've got some French ultramarine on my brush. I'm trying to create a few more feather flicks on top of his head. I'm painting on dry paper here. I'll use my damp brush to soften those bottom edges. Now I'll wash the paint out of my brush and I'll use my damp brush to soften away any edges that I don't like. Now I decided that I was pussyfooting around up there, so I've just picked up a bit more French ultramarine. I've painted it onto the dry paper. I felt that the back of the head needed to be darker, so I've put the paint on there on the dry paper. And what I'm going to do is wash the paint out of my brush and soften the paint edge along the front. I felt I was just mucking around with it too much. With a clean brush now, I'll soften that edge. I'll take some of that onto the dry paper here. And I think I need to paint a bit more above the eye with some grey. I've got my grey mixture, French ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. The paper's dry. I thought I'd paint a few little lines above the eye. And that will add a bit of detail there. Maybe a little bit underneath as well. Bring in the beak line. A little bit more here. And if I make a mark I don't like, I can probably use my wet brush to smooth it out, take it off. Here I've got some Payne's grey on my brush. I'm breaking up that line of darker feathers. I'm at the fussing stage now. I'm just about ready to put my brush down and call it a day. Okay, one last thing I'll do. I want to paint a little shadow here where the wing touches the body. So that's a bit of water. I'll get my grey mixture, French ultramarine and burnt sienna. And I'll paint that on there as a little shadow. And I think that's about it. I'll take the washi tape off. And there's my finished painting. I hope that was helpful to you. Thanks everybody. I look forward to seeing your finished paintings.